Whoa, I used to have it, red big woman. Whoa, boy, she ain't nothing but skin and bone. Whoa, the first time I...
Hey everybody, what's up? I'm Jason Kishinev. Welcome back to A People's Historian, the show where we read about 30 minutes of history together. We're reading chapter 10 of Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States. If you like what you hear, hit the like and subscribe button. Let's dig in. The opening of the West was being helped by mechanization of the farm. Iron plows cut plowing time in half. By the 1850s, John Deere Company was turning out 10,000 plows a year. Cyrus McCormick was making 1,000 mechanical reapers a year in his factory in Chicago. A man with a sickle could cut half an acre of wheat in a day. With a reaper, he could cut 10 acres. Turnpikes, canals, and railroads were bringing more people west, more products east, and it became important to keep that new West, tumultuous and unpredictable, under control. We wouldn't want them getting any funny thoughts now, would we? When colleges were established out west, Eastern businessmen, as Cochrane and Miller say, were determined from the start to control Western education. Edward Everett, the Massachusetts politician and orator, spoke in 1833 on behalf of giving financial aid to Western colleges. Let no Boston capitalist, then, let no man who has a large stake in New England think that he is called upon to exercise his liberality at a distance toward those in whom he has no concern. They ask you to give security to your own property by diffusing the means of light and truth throughout the region, where so much of the power to preserve or to shake it resides. The capitalists of the East were conscious of the need for this security to your own property. As technology developed, more capital was needed, more risks had to be taken, and a big investment needed stability. In an economic system not rationally planned for human need, but developing fitfully, chaotically out of the profit motive, there seemed to be no way to avoid recurrent booms and slumps. Something that we know nothing about nowadays, right? There was a slump in 1837, another in 1853. One way to achieve stability was to decrease competition, organize the businesses, move toward monopoly. How'd that get there? In the mid-1850s, price agreements and mergers became frequent. The New York Central Railroad was a merger of many railroads. The American Brass Association was formed to meet ruinous competition, it said. The Hampton County Cotton Spinners Association was organized to control prices, and so was the American Iron Association. Another way to minimize risks was to make sure the government played its traditional role, going back to Alexander Hamilton and the First Congress, of helping the business interests. State legislatures gave charters to corporations, giving them legal rights to conduct business, raise money. At first special charters, then general charters, so that any business meeting certain requirements could incorporate. Between 1790 and 1860, 2,300 corporations were chartered, which over 70 years doesn't seem like that many, does it? Railroad men traveled to Washington and to state capitals armed with money, shares of stock, free railroad passes, get out of jail free cards. No, I'm just kidding, it doesn't say that. Between 1850 and 1857, they got 25 million acres of public land free of charge and millions of dollars in bonds, loans from the state legislatures. In Wisconsin in 1856, the La Crosse and Milwaukee Railroad got 1 million acres free by distributing about $900,000 in stocks and bonds to 59 assemblymen, 13 senators, the governor. 2 years later, the railroad was bankrupt and the bonds were worthless. In the East, mill owners had become powerful and organized. By 1850, 15 Boston families called the Associates controlled 20% of the cotton spindlage in the United States, 39% of insurance capital in Massachusetts, 40% of banking resources in Boston. And their descendants all donate to our Congress. Everybody. In the school books, those years, but that's seriously, they probably do though. In the school books, those years are filled with the controversy over slavery. But on the eve of the Civil War, it was money and profit, not the movement against slavery, that was uppermost in the priorities of the men who ran the country. As Cochrane and Miller put it, Webster was the hero of the North. Not Emerson, Parker, Garrison, or Phillips. Webster, the tariff man, the land speculator, the corporation lawyer, politician for the Boston Associates, inheritor of Hamilton's coronet. The great object of government, said he, is the protection of property at home and respect and renown abroad. For these he preached union. For these he surrendered the fugitive slave. They described the Boston rich, living sumptuously on Beacon Hill, admired by their neighbors for their philanthropy and their patronage of art and culture. These men traded in State Street while overseers ran their factories, managers directed their railroads, agents sold their water power and real estate. They were absentee landlords in the most complete sense. Uncontaminated by the diseases of the factory town, they were also protected from hearing the complaints of their workers or suffering mental depression from dismal and squalid surroundings. In the metropolis, art, literature, education, science flowered in the golden day. In the industrial towns, children went to work with their fathers and mothers. Schools and doctors were only promises. A bed of one's own was a rare luxury. Ralph Waldo Emerson described Boston in those years. There was a certain poor smell in all the streets, in Beacon Street and Mount Vernon, as well as in the lawyers' offices and the wharves, and the same meanness and sterility and leave all hope behind as one finds in a boot manufacturer's premises. The preacher Theodore Parker told his congregation, "Money is this day the strongest power of the nation." The attempts at political stability, at economic control, did not quite work. The new industrialism, the crowded cities, the long hours in the factories, the sudden economic crises leading to high prices and lost jobs, the lack of food and water, the freezing winters, the hot tenements in the summer, the epidemics of disease, the deaths of children. These led to sporadic reactions from the poor. Sometimes there were spontaneous, unorganized uprisings against the rich. Sometimes the anger was deflected into racial hatred for blacks, religious warfare against Catholics, nativist fury against immigrants, Sometimes it was organized into demonstrations and strikes. Jacksonian democracy had tried to create a consensus of support for the system to make it secure. Blacks, Indians, women, and foreigners were clearly outside the consensus, but also white working people in large numbers declared themselves outside. The full extent of the working class consciousness of those years, as of any years, is lost in history. But fragments remain and make us wonder how much of this always existed underneath the very practical silence of working people. In 1827, an address before the mechanics and working classes of Philadelphia was recorded, written by an unlettered mechanic, probably a young shoemaker, who said, now why does he guess shoemaker? Who said, "We find ourselves oppressed on every hand. We labor hard in producing all the comforts of life for the enjoyment of others, while we ourselves obtain but a scanty portion, and even that in the present state of society depends on the will of employers." How true. How true. Frances Wright of Scotland, an early feminist and utopian socialist, was invited by Philadelphia working men to speak on the 4th of July, 1829, to one of the first citywide associations of labor unions in the United States. She asked if the revolution had been fought to crush down the sons and daughters of your country's industry under neglect, poverty, vice, starvation, and disease. She wondered if the new technology was not lowering the value of human labor, making people appendages to machines, crippling the minds and bodies of child laborers. It's funny on that topic, it has nothing to do with history. I just went to my local supermarket and they just put in self-check machines they didn't used to have. Quite disturbed. Part of me really wants to use the self-check machines, but part of me really doesn't want to see those people lose their jobs. The good part of me doesn't want to see those people lose their jobs. Later that year, George Henry Evans, a printer, editor of the Working Man's Advocate, wrote the Working Men's Declaration of Independence. Among its list of facts submitted to candid and impartial fellow citizens. Number 1, the laws for levying taxes are operating most oppressively on one class of society. Number 3, the laws for private incorporation are all partial, favoring one class of society to the expense of the other. Number 6, the laws have deprived 9/10 of the members of the body politics who are not wealthy of the equal means to enjoy life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The lien law in favor of the landlords against tenants is one illustration among innumerable others. Evans believed that all on arriving at adult age are entitled to expand property. Let's just start that over. That was my rewind noise. Evans believed that all on arriving at adult age are entitled to equal property. A citywide trades union in Boston in 1834, including mechanics from Charlestown and women shoe binders from Lynn, referred to the Declaration of Independence. We hold that laws which have a tendency to raise any peculiar class above their fellow citizens by granting special privileges are contrary to and in defiance of these primary principles. One public system of education which so liberally endows those seminaries of learning which are only accessible to the wealthy, while our common schools are so illy provided for. Thus, even in childhood, the poor are apt to think themselves inferior. In his book, Most Uncommon Jacksonians, interesting title, Edward Pessin says the leaders of the Jacksonian labor movement were radicals. How else describe men who believed American society to be torn with social conflict, disfigured by the misery of the masses, and dominated by a greedy elite whose power over every aspect of American life was based on private property? Episodes of insurrection of that time have gone unrecorded in traditional histories. Such was the riot in Baltimore in the summer of 1835, when the Bank of Maryland collapsed and its depositors lost their savings. Convinced that a great fraud had taken place, a crowd gathered and began breaking the windows of officials associated with the bank. When the rioters destroyed a house, the militia attacked, killing some 20 people, wounding 100. The next evening, other houses were attacked. The events were reported in Niles' Weekly Register, an important newspaper of that time. Last night, Sunday, at dark, the attack was renewed upon Reverdy Johnston's house. There was now no opposition. It was supposed that several thousand people were spectators of the scene. The house was soon entered, and its furniture, a very expensive law library, and all its contents were cast forth. A bonfire made of them in front of the house. The whole interior of the house was torn out and cast upon the burning pile. The marble portico in front and a great portion of the front wall were torn down by about 11 o'clock. They proceeded to that of the mayor of the city, Jesse Hunt, Esquire, broke it open, took out the furniture, and burnt it before the door. During those years, trade unions were forming. The courts called them conspiracies to restrain trade, and therefore illegal. As when in New York, 25 members of the Union Society of Journeymen Tailors were found guilty of conspiracy to injure trade, riot, assault, battery. The judge, levying fines, said, "In this favored land of law and liberty, the road to advancement is open to all. Every American knows that, or ought to know that. He has no better friend than the laws, and that he needs no artificial combination for his protection. They are of foreign origin, and I am led to believe mainly upheld by foreigners." A handbill was then circulated throughout the city. The rich against the poor. Judge Edwards, the tool of the aristocracy, against the people. Mechanics and working men, a deadly blow has been struck at your liberty. They have established the precedent that working men have no right to regulate the price of labor, or in other words, the rich are the only judges of the wants of the poor man. At City Hall Park, 27,000 people gathered to denounce the court decision and elected a committee of correspondence, which organized 3 months later a convention of mechanics, farmers, and working men, elected by farmers and working people in various towns in New York State. The convention met in Utica, drew up a Declaration of Independence from existing political parties, and established an equal rights party. Although they ran their own candidates for office, there was no great confidence in the ballot as a way of achieving change. one of the great orators of the movement, Seth Luther, told a 4th of July rally, "We will try the ballot box first. If that will not affect our righteous purpose, the next and last resort is the cartridge box." And one sympathetic local newspaper, the Albany Microscope, warned, "Remember the regretted fate of the working men. They were soon destroyed by hitching teams and rolling with parties. They admitted into their ranks broken down lawyers and politicians. They became perverted and were unconsciously drawn into a vortex from which they never escaped." The crisis of 1837 led to rallies and meetings in many cities. The banks had suspended specie payments, refusing to pay hard money for the banknotes they had issued. Prices rose, and working people, already hard-pressed to buy food, found that flour that had sold at $5.62 a barrel was now $12 a barrel. Pork went up. Coal went up. In Philadelphia, 20,000 people assembled, and someone wrote to President Van Buren describing it. "This afternoon, the largest public meeting I ever saw assembled in Independence Square. It was called by placards posted throughout the city yesterday and last night. It was projected and carried on entirely by the working classes without consultation or cooperation with any of those who usually take the lead in such matters. The officers and speakers were of those classes. It was directed against the banks." In New York, members of the Equal Rights Party, often called the Locofocos. That's pretty good. The Equal Rights Party, often called the Locofocos, all one word, announced a meeting. Bread, meat, rent, and fuel. Their prices must come down. The people will meet in the park, rain or shine, at 4:00 p.m. on Monday afternoon. All friends of humanity determined to resist monopolists and extortioners are invited to attend. The Commercial Register, a New York newspaper, reported on the meeting and what followed. At 4:00, a concourse of several thousands had convened in front of City Hall. Excuse me. One of these orators is reported to have expressly directed the popular vengeance against Mr. Eli Hart, who is one of our most extensive flour dealers on commission. "Fellow citizens," he exclaimed, "Mr. Hart has now 53,000 barrels of flour in his store. Let us go and offer him $8 a barrel. And if he does not take it, A large body of the meeting moved off in the direction of Mr. Hart's store. The middle door had been forced, and some 20 or 30 barrels of flour or more rolled into the streets, and the heads staved in. At this point of time, Mr. Hart himself arrived on the ground with a posse of officers from the police. The officers were assailed by a portion of the mob in Day Street. Their staves wrested from them and shivered to pieces. Barrels of flour by dozens, 50s and 100s, were tumbled into the street from the doors and thrown in rapid succession from the windows. About 1,000 bushels of wheat and flour and 400 or 500 barrels of flour were thus wantonly and foolishly, as well as wickedly, destroyed. The most active of the destructionists were foreigners. Indeed, the greater part of the assemblage was of exotic origin, but there were probably 500 or 1,000 others standing by and abetting their incendiary laborers. Probably just made the price of flour go up, huh? Amidst the falling and bursting of the barrels and sacks of wheat, numbers of women were engaged, like the crones who stripped the dead in battle, filling the boxes and baskets with which they were provided, and their aprons with flour and making off with it. Night had now closed upon the scene, but the work of destruction did not cease until strong bodies of police arrived, followed soon afterward by detachment of troops. This was the Flour Riot of 1837. During the crisis of that year, 50,000 persons, 1/3 of the working class, were without work in New York City alone, and 200,000 of a population of 500,000 were living, as one observer put it, in utter and hopeless distress. There is no complete record of the meetings, riots, actions, organized and disorganized, violent and non-violent, which took place in the mid-19th century as the country grew, as the cities became crowded with working conditions bad. As the cities became crowded with working conditions bad, living conditions intolerable, with the economy in the hands of bankers, speculators, landlords, merchants. In 1835, 50 different trades organized unions in Philadelphia, and there was a successful general strike of laborers, factory workers, bookbinders, jewelers, coal heavers, butchers, cabinet workers for the 10-hour day. Soon there were 10-hour laws in Pennsylvania and other states, but they provided that employers could have employees sign contracts for longer hours. The law at this time was developing a strong defense of contracts. It was pretended that work contracts were voluntary agreements between equals. Weavers in Philadelphia in the early 1840s, mostly Irish immigrants working at home for employers, struck for higher wages, attacked the homes of those refusing to strike, and destroyed their work. A sheriff's posse tried to arrest some strikers, but it was broken up by 400 weavers armed with muskets and sticks. Soon, however, antagonism developed between these Irish Catholic weavers and native-born Protestant skilled workers over issues of religion. In May 1844, there were Protestant Catholic riots in Kensington, a suburb of Philadelphia. Nativist anti-immigrant rioters destroyed the weavers' neighborhoods and attacked a Catholic church. Middle-class politicians soon led each group into a different political party. The nativists into the American Republican Party, the Irish into the Democratic Party. Party politics and religion now substituting for class conflict. The rest of all this, says David Montgomery, historian of the Kensington riots, was the fragmentation of the Philadelphia working class. Keep them arguing about religion. It just causes division. It thereby created for historians the illusion of a society lacking in class conflict, while in reality the class conflicts of 19th century America were as fierce as any known in the industrial world. The immigrants from Ireland fleeing starvation there when the potato crop failed were coming to America now packed into old sailing ships. The stories of these ships differ only in detail from the accounts of the ships that earlier brought black slaves and later German, Italian, Russian immigrants. This is a contemporary account of one ship arriving from Ireland, detained at Grosse Isle on the Canadian border. On the 18th of May, 1847, the Urania from Cork, with several hundred immigrants on board, a large proportion of them sick and dying of the ship fever, was put into quarantine at Grosse Isle. This was the first of plague-smitten ships from Ireland, which that year sailed up the St. Lawrence. But before the first week of June, as many as 84 ships of various tonnage were driven in by an easterly wind, and of that enormous number of vessels there was not one free from the taint of malignant typhus, the offspring of famine and of the foul shiphold. A tolerably quick passage occupied from 6 to 8 weeks. Who can imagine the horrors of even the shortest passage in an emigrant ship crowded beyond its utmost capacity of stowage with unhappy beings of all ages with fever raging in their midst? The crew, sullen or brutal from very desperation, were paralyzed with terror of the plague. The miserable passengers, unable to help themselves or afford the least relief to each other, 1/4 or 1/3 or 1/2 of the entire number in different stages of the disease, many dying, some dead, the fatal poison intensified by the indescribable foulness of the air breathed and rebreathed by the gaping sufferers, the wails of children, the ravings of the delirious, the cries and groans of those in mortal agony. Whew, sure paints a picture. There was no accommodation of any kind on the island. Sheds were rapidly filled with the miserable people. Hundreds were literally flung on the beach, left amid the mud and stones to crawl on the dry land how they could. Many of these gasped out their last breath on that fatal shore, not able to drag themselves from the slime in which they lay. Wow. It was not until the 1st of November that the quarantine of Grosse Isle was closed. Upon that barren isle, as many as 10,000 of the Irish race were consigned to the grave pit. All right. Thank you for joining me. If you enjoyed the reading, please do hit that like and subscribe button. Hit that notification bell so you get notified each time I make a new video. And we'll see you next time. Thank you for joining me.